Good morning and welcome to this meeting of the Scottish Affairs Committee. We're joined this morning by two colleagues from other committees who are guesting on our committee. So that's Antonia Bands from the Business and Trade Committee and Torquil Crichton from the Energy and Net Zero Committee, I think it's called. So welcome to them and welcome to our witnesses. Good morning, gentlemen. I think some of us met Colin and Iain when we visited Grangemouth recently, and others were involved in a Zoom call with Anu recently too. So faces are familiar even if we've not been in this particular sort of setting before. So welcome. We're just going to go straight into questions. But I'll ask each of you just to introduce yourselves, please, and say briefly where you work, what you do.
Morning. Iain Hardie, Head of Legal and External Affairs for Petroineos.
Good morning. Colin Pritchard, Sustainability and External Relations Director for INEOS Olefins and Polymers UK, based in Grangemouth.
Good morning. My name's Bhambi. I lead the energy transition business at EY in the UK.
Thank you all. I'm going to open with my first question, which is, I wondered, we've heard some variations to this date, but I wondered when Petroineos first realised that Grangemouth was no longer, or that at least the oil refinery was no longer a viable business in its current form.
So we've been engaging with government for a number of years on exactly that point, recognising that the forward trajectory for liquid fuels was in decline. There was the ban on ICE, the internal combustion engine, 2030 in Scotland, 2035 in England. There was a series of ever increasing and ever expensive turnarounds due on the refinery, and those were aspects of information that we shared with government and with workforce for a number of years. Clearly, the decision to make the closure decision was a hard one. And we did it in two phases. Firstly, in announcing our intention to close the refinery. And we did that, to be fair, to the market and to our workforce, and because an important part of the transition from refinery through to terminal is making sure we're operationally ready. And that's really what we've been doing for the last 12 months, is going through that process of internal transition as an organisation from an operational perspective and from a commercial perspective, really to create a new business so that we can continue to supply Scotland's fuel needs in the long term.
Would you be able to put a date on when those discussions first began?
We had discussions with representatives of Scottish and UK government as long as 5 years ago, where we ran them through three broad agenda items. One was the challenges faced by the refinery and its loss-making nature. I think those figures are well publicised. The shareholders have invested over £1 billion in the refinery since its inception in 2011, and they've lost over 600 million. So that was a key part, and that has remained a constant. The second part of our discussion was our commitment to maintain continuity of supply for Scotland and the importance of creating a viable terminal business. And the third bit of all these discussions, and I say this with confidence because I was in these meetings, was around the energy transition and the important role that Grangemouth could play as a hub for low carbon manufacturing in the future. But as it stood today, and today could mean any point in the preceding 5 years, the regulatory and fiscal framework was not conducive to investing in low carbon biofuels or other low carbon manufacturing opportunities on site. And therefore there was a threat, as now realised, that we could be left with several hundred acres of brownfield land absent an intervention by Scottish or UK government.
Was there any attempt made by either government to assist your company to carry on at Grangemouth with the refinery?
There was rhetoric. There was repeated statements by ministers in Scottish and UK government that they would leave no stone unturned to ensure the refinery continued to operate. However, we are where we are, and both governments were given the opportunity, both governments were given the data and access to the data to make an investment decision, and neither government chose to do that. I can only presume that they drew the same conclusions that we've drawn, that in continued refinery operations in Grangemouth was not an economic proposition, and therefore they weren't willing to put taxpayers' money into that vehicle.
And if those discussions began 5 years ago, When was the final decision made that, yes, this is the plan now, we're going to withdraw?
That final decision was made when we made our first announcement to staff that there was the intention to transition, and then laterally we had the final decision in January of this year where we concluded that the decision was made because we had to run through a consultation process, and that process has taken, we took longer than the statutory 45 days because we were committed to do it fairly, thoroughly and robustly. And I think feedback from union representatives on site has been that that has been, so far as it can be, recognising it as a difficult process, well managed, and I think that's a credit to the shareholders and the refinery management.
Okay. We've heard, and you'll forgive me, I'm not a technical expert in these matters by any manner of means, but we've heard in evidence that one of the problems you have with the refinery is around the hydrocracker unit. Is that correct? Is that currently out of action? And if it is, how much would it take to bring it back into operation?
You're absolutely right. There's been a lot of focus on the hydrocracker unit, and I'm not sure why, because that belies the broader problems that beset the refinery. The Grangemouth refinery is a bottom quartile performing refinery on the Solomon, which is the independent index for refineries in North West Europe. It has significant energy inefficiencies due to disaggregated units. It has high cost of capex due to its age and configuration, and its operating costs are high as well. So those are the fundamentals. The other market fundamentals is we're in a declining market, and that is something out with our control. Grangemouth being one of the oldest refineries in Europe, the second oldest in Europe and the oldest in the UK, it's perhaps unsurprising that it's the first to fail in that regard. The hydrocracker was important. It's a vital piece of upgrading kit for the refinery, and a lot of value is driven from that. However, even if it was operational, it wouldn't have offset the $500,000 a day losses that were being incurred in the lead up to the refinery closure. And any suggestion that we didn't run with all pace and all rigour and all diligence to try and get that unit back online is simply incorrect. And it was a source of frustration really for the staff on site, because people were working day and night to get that unit back on, and we had 5 attempted restarts for that unit, and then management and shareholders concluded, and I think rightly, that they did not have the confidence to continue down that path, and so the decision was made that we had to stop, and then in parallel with that there was the refinery closure decision.
It's also been suggested that if the hydrocracker were working, it would be a relatively, and I use the word carefully, a relatively straightforward, perhaps not easy, but straightforward thing to convert the refinery to producing sustainable aviation fuel in a relatively, as I say, short period of time. Is that correct?
No. So there's two fundamental points there. One is that it's conversion to a sustainable aviation fuel production facility doesn't rely on the hydrocracker exclusively, point one. And perhaps the more fundamental point is that if we were to produce biofuels at Grangemouth, it would be what we call first generation biofuels, which you would use HEFA, and I think you would have heard Mr Thompson speak about that last week. As it currently stands, under UK regulation, there's a cap set on the amount of HEFA that can be used. That's set so low as to amount to an effective ban, and therefore you're in this chicken and egg scenario. So even if we did have the production facilities, which we don't, the feedstock that you require to put into that process is not available to you. The irony here being, and this is something the committee we wish to explore, is the SAF mandate still exists, and so we as producers are required to go to the European market, import European HEFA-derived SAF to then sell in the UK, which seems perverse. And indeed, that's one of the findings of the Willow report, and a very clear example of where unintended consequences of regulation has led to a lack of credible investment environment for a potential SAF plant at Grangemouth. Not saying exclusively, but it's certainly one of the very clear markers that could, and we would argue should be addressed in order to unlock potential SAF development at Grangemouth.
It will be something we come back to in the second phase of our inquiry, so thank you very much for that. You have a supplementary, Kirsty?
Yes, I do. Thank you. I just want to pick up on the hydrocracker point, because it does still seem to be a bone of contention, and we've received conflicting information. So I think you said there had been 5 attempted restarts and came to the conclusion that it just wasn't possible to get it fully operational again. However, when we had a representative of Unite the Union here, their position is that the hydrocracker had been repaired and was fully operational. So I'm trying to get to the bottom of these two conflicting views. Were the unions involved in any discussions around the hydrocracker, and were they aware of the attempted restarts and why you'd decided that it couldn't come back into full operation?
There is a remarkable level of focus on the hydrocracker that I simply don't understand. I'd encourage you to take the word of the company as to the efforts made to restart that unit. And what we can do is share with you some written evidence we provided to Scottish Government on exactly this point, which might help clarify.
I do appreciate that, but could you answer my question as to whether any union officials were involved in discussions or were aware of the attempted restarts? I just think it's really important that this committee has a clear view of whether the hydrocracker is operational or not, although I do take on board your point that it's perhaps not the central issue, but I think the union position is somewhat different.
Yeah, and we'll address the union position, and you'll get written evidence that will very clearly explain the timeline, and there is a timeline of events that we can share with you. Were the unions directly involved in discussions around the hydrocracker restart? I would presume not. It's an operational issue that the business would take in the ordinary course. Would there be local union representatives at site aware of exactly what's going on? Absolutely. So they do have an important line of access to information. I think probably what you're hearing is a disconnect between a narrative from Unite HQ and the local representatives on site. And I think we need to be mindful of that, because it is becoming increasingly obvious to us that there are some wedge issues being played here that we need to be aware of. So, Ms. Sullivan, what I'll do is I will get you that written evidence and I'll submit it to Henny, and hopefully that can be circulated to the committee, if that's okay.
I think that would be helpful. Thank you.
I think it would be great to have.
I will do that. Thank you.
Susan Murray.
Thank you very much. This is really for Mr. Hardie and Mr. Pritchard. It's just there's been, Mr. Hardie has mentioned a number of times the policy perhaps not being conducive to investing in energy transition. Can you just maybe just outline how UK policy has influenced your decision to close the refinery?
Yeah, maybe if we can, I'll certainly speak to that, and then I think we can also speak more broadly to the Willow and the broader policy framework within which we operate in the larger energy sector, because Grangemouth is more than just the refinery. So as regards the refinery, we're grappling with a number of issues. There's the operational, there's the macroeconomic issues, and this isn't a direct answer to your question, but it's important. The macroeconomic context for the refinery closure is essential. As I said before, the UK's oldest refinery, bottom quartile performing, energy inefficient, very high capital and operating costs. We simply cannot compete with the newer refineries coming on stream in the Middle East, Asia and Africa. And finished fuel is a global commodity that can be moved around the world with ease. And that's a positive and a negative for domestic manufacturing. The other issues we've been grappling with is decline in the UK market. So there is penetration by EV and hybrid vehicles, and that's naturally seeing a decline in the demand for fossil fuels. And I guess the final, if you want a direct answer around policy, UK and Scottish Government has made the collective decision to ban new build combustion engines, so petrol and diesel cars, post 2030 and 2035 in England. So against that backdrop, it's perhaps not unsurprising that a refinery that manufactures petrol and diesel will struggle. And I think that is central to the underlying rationale for refinery closure. If I may, Ms. Murray, if I may pivot to Colin, I think there's also important broader issues around UK policy approach for the cluster at large that might help your thinking as well.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you, Iain. That's, I guess, part of the genesis of Willow itself is that the proposition we've looked at cases for doing new processes in new plants that would be within the energy transition, both within the refinery and within the chemicals business. And I think there's a broad fundamental, and it's an expression that if you come across me, you're probably sick of hearing me go, but we need to create policies that is doing something different to banning the current state that we want to move from, but actually supports the move to the new state that we want to do. I can understand on the basis of a simplicity and looking like action, it's much easier to ban what we think we don't want than it is to create what we do want. And some very trite illustrations of it would be, the topical subject of low emission zones. If you're looking about vehicles coming into the centre of big cities, it's easy to ban vehicles from coming in, but actually a better policy outcome, I would suggest, is having a public transport system that's low carbon, low cost and efficient, and means why would you wish to drive any vehicle into the centre of town? You can see that replicated across oil and gas, that we've seemed to be quite happy to move to ban oil and gas in the UK in our own production, rather than actually pushing renewables so far that it naturally phases out oil and gas, and you can transition. And in fact, when you think about that, you begin to see that genesis of what we saw in Willow, was we kept on looking at doing business cases for new plants. It didn't make economic sense. And you end up not being able to invest in the new while the existing is being made uneconomic or being banned. You can see that happening in the oil and gas sector. Iain's just explained exactly why that happened in the refining sector. It was a fourth quartile refinery. You could have invested in new equipment to actually upgrade it, but the signal, from governments, both Scottish and UK, was that there is no internal combustion engine, there is no future, so there is no period of time for it to pay back. So the business has reacted to that policy and regulatory framework and gets to a point where it is beyond it to do anything other than close. But it's the same for the next step of the energy transition. So my fear, and sort of talking with Iain, the genesis of the idea that we had for Willow, was that there is a policy gap here. We need to get the governments engaged in the process. We need this co-design process in order to be able to help us create a business case that we can invest in to get the regulatory and policy framework right. That means we can invest. But we also, and the thing that's very different about the approach to Willow, is we actually need to address the community, climate change and skills benefits that will come to society as a whole in order to effectively make the business case for governments as to why they should change that regulatory and policy framework. So working together to get that across, if you've seen the outset, the 7 lenses of how we're looking at Willow. I hope that helps address.
Thank you very much. So just to sort of dig into that a little bit, what implications does the refinery's closure have on the UK's fuel supply at the moment? I mean, clearly prices are changing and you've talked about importing fuel, but is there not a case for having an onshore UK supply, or sorry, I don't mean but supply in the UK?
Understand. So as regards fuel security, there's no change. We've invested £30 million in site to improve the infrastructure and tankage at Grangemouth to underpin that. And what we've done, and we've done this in conjunction with scrutiny from the energy security team at DESNES and with validation by an external consultant, we've created what we're calling a virtual pipeline, if you like, from the major European supply hub of ARA, Amsterdam, Rotterdam and Antwerp. We've taken long-term storage positions there. We've taken long-term charter parties of the specific class of vessel that can get in and out of the Grangemouth docks, and obviously we've got control of the Grangemouth terminal and jetty as a result of our ownership of the former refinery business. So we have control of each element of the supply chain, and that will ensure that we with our long-term storage in ARA, with our long-term storage capability at Grangemouth, we have sufficient ullage and molecule flow to ensure that we keep Scotland wet with fuel into the longer term. And as I say, that's been validated externally, and it's been validated by the UK Government Energy Security Team.
Thank you very much. I think you've just answered the next question. I was going to ask about energy security for the UK into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Murray.
So, thank you. We'll now move on to Maureen Bracknick.
Thank you, Chair. Can I direct the question to Mr Hardie and Mr Pritchard? Can I ask that how many refinery workers will be made redundant in April? I know there has been media reports suggesting that there could be a total of 435 job losses over the next 18 months. And can you tell me how accurate this figure is?
So let me give you the accurate details there. Ms Burke, we took 470 colleagues through the consultation process. There was a total of 377 voluntary redundancies and 28 compulsory redundancies, so 5% of headcount. Our transition team, which will operate for between 12 and 18 months as we move from refinery to terminal business, will be 170 roles, and ultimately the terminal business itself will have 65 full-time roles. We've facilitated 36 cross-site moves to our sister company INEOS, and we've made sure that all 18 of our apprentices are able to finish their training either with us or we facilitated moves to local third parties.
Thank you for that. Can I ask if all the employees facing redundancy will receive their 18 months pay if they decide?
Yes, so that's something. So we moved very early on in the process. In fact, before we made our intention clear before we made our announcement of the intention to transition, we'd already moved from statutory to 18-month redundancy terms, and that was in recognition of trying to put some financial security around what was a very uncomfortable position, and I think that has served us well, and our staff and our unions and our employee forums have responded well to that. So yeah, that's available to everyone who is taking voluntary redundancy or compulsory redundancy.
Thank you.
Can I just make a point on there? Because I know there has been some confusion and conversations in here. So that's with respect to Petroineos employees. There are currently within consultation process, there will be some potential redundancies within the INEOS businesses, so INEOS Chemicals Grangemouth Limited, and also the utilities and infrastructure businesses, INEOS Infrastructure Grangemouth Limited. Those are in consultation at the moment, so I can't tell you any details about where that is. But just to be clear, and I only clarify that because I know there were questions asked in the House, but just to be clear, the 18 months only applies to Petroineos employees.
Thank you for clarifying that. Thank you very much. We know that the job losses are going to have a big impact on the community, and I was just wondering if there has been any assessment made on the number of indirect job losses.
PwC conducted a piece of work on behalf of Scottish Government that looked at that, and it looked at the broader implications of the supply chain. And yes, so that analysis is there.
Thank you.
Torkel.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, gentlemen, for coming in. Just to clarify that, you seem to indicate that emergency responders and shared services, will they be covered by the 18-month deal?
Those are going through consultation at the moment. They are employed by a different legal entity, INEOS Chemicals Grangemouth Limited, or INEOS Infrastructure Grangemouth Limited. So they are not subject to the 18 months that Petroineos have given to the Petroineos employees. We are much the same in this context as any of the indirect employees through the rest of the Scottish supply chain.
In short, they probably won't be covered then.
Their exact terms are currently in consultation, but they are not covered by the 18-month commitment that Petroineos have made to Petroineos employees.
Thank you.
Antonia.
Thank you, Chair. But you as an employer could decide to voluntarily include those employees in that guarantee. Why have you decided not to do that?
We're in a consultation process. I can't tell you what the outcome from that one is. I would also suggest that there is no difference between us as an indirect employee versus the burger van that might be going from 3 employees down to 2 employees as a result of the refinery closing.
Well, I mean, that's an obvious nonsense, given that you're a partner in the joint vehicle.
Yes, we are, but they are separate legal entities.
The burger van isn't, is it?
Yes, true enough, and I withdraw that, I apologise. But yes, in terms of the context, they are separate legal entities and they need to go through their due and correct consultation process.
Okay, so will you commit to make sure that your employees, I know you said that you're just a member of the supply chain, but you can voluntarily commit here to make sure that your employees have similar, if not the same, terms of redundancy as the Petroineos employees. Are you able to do that today?
No.
Okay, will you write to this committee to tell us the terms that you do offer?
I'm not sure what the policy is on that one, but I will take that back to and find out whether, I presume we're allowed to disclose, but I will find out what we're allowed to disclose from the conversations and the consultation process.
Thank you. And if I may, Chair, the PwC report said 2,800, over 2,800 potential impact on the supply chain. What further action are you taking to mitigate that, perhaps in consult with your partners in the relevant governments and local authority?
We've worked with SMAS, which is Scottish Manufacturing Advisory Service, to provide support for the supply chain. But I mean, a point to remember here, Ms Bance, is that the supply chain are a big, sophisticated creature. In fact, quite often, the supply chain are companies far larger than Petroineos itself. They have their own meaningful role to play in the energy transition. They were consulted through Project Willow, and we'd hope, actually coming full circle, they'll have an important role to play in the transformation of the Grangemouth industrial cluster in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Angus MacDonald.
The decision to close the refinery has been described as unite as needless act of vandalism, industrial vandalism. How would you react to that?
I find that language troubling and unnecessary. I think we've been very clear, very transparent with our approach to refinery closure, and that was, you saw that in the split announcement that we did, where we talked about the intention and then ultimately having to make the closure decision. I think you'll also see a schism between Unite HQ and the local representatives of Unite. The relationships with our employees, our local union reps and our employee forums on site is excellent. They understand that they understand the position of the Grangemouth refinery in the macroeconomic space it sits, and I think they understand very well as to the reasons for the closure. And as I say, we have tried from the outset to put a financial security blanket around them to the best we can with the 18-month redundancy terms. Beyond that, of course, it is a challenge, but I think we need to now focus on the go forward, and that's why Petroineos conceived Project Willow. We took this to government to try and articulate the case for change going forward, recognising that before refinery closure we'd done our own internal analysis to try and understand if there was any commercially viable opportunities for redevelopment on site, and the answer was no. So with that, what do we do? Do we rest on our hands and do nothing, or do we try and move the narrative forward? We took the latter, and we went to government with a plan for trying to identify the barriers to change and how they could be unlocked. And that was the genesis of Willow, and that programme of co-design, working hand in glove with Scottish Government, UK Government and the unions, I think is a first of a kind way of addressing these totemic challenges we've got for industrial change in the UK. And I think the product of it is something that the unions have reflected on as being a positive outcome, and certainly, you know, our First Minister recognised its success, our Prime Minister has recognised its success, and we look forward to driving that agenda forward.
I think taking your voluntary, people accepting voluntary redundancy as a very high level is good, and suggests to me that 18 months is roughly the right sort of figure. Just picking up on Antonio's figure, assuming 50% of Petroineos is owned by INEOS, I really can't understand why you would not stand up and say, we were very supportive of the 18 months and we would do this the same for our own business. And this might be above your pay grade, which is why you're not telling us, but I think everybody in this room would leave here very much more relaxed if we felt that the INEOS were the people who were driving the fair 18-month payment rather than Petrochina.
I might help Colin out here because I've been through the process. When you're in a consultation, such as they are now actively in the consultation, there is a consultation room, and what stays in the consultation room stays in the consultation room. Colin is not part of that process, so he will not have access to that information. And even if he did have access to the information, I can assure you he wouldn't be allowed to speak to it today. So it will run its course. Clearly, the unions and others will make representations around the 18 months, I suspect. But we'll just have to wait for that process to run its ordinary course through its statutory 45-day process.
Again, something I think the committee will look out for with interest
Add
in the
that
coming
to the
weeks.
to-do list.
Please, thank you. Kirstine.
Thank you, Chair. Project Willow analysed 300 potential technologies that could be deployed at Grangemouth. Why did you choose those particular 9 proposed projects?
Wonderful. We actually looked at 368. We just felt that the precise number in the documentation would be a little bit too much detail. So we went through a process against the sort of direction that we'd received from UK government, Scottish government, Scottish enterprise, Petroineos, INEOS and Petrochina, which was, can you please make sure that as you go through this analysis that you have something real at the end of it? And if there isn't something real at the end of it, early on, tell us so we can close the project down and walk away. So one of the things we needed to do was to have a look at the technology readiness level of each technology. We needed to understand how these technologies could possibly come together. We used a lens around a local sort of supply source, local demand source, and local infrastructure that should be leveraged. And the idea was that this particular combination of potential projects should be able to withstand a global competition. If we truly want to bring private sector investment into a concept like Willow, then people who tend to deploy this capital have lots of places they can deploy capital across the world. And what we needed to do is make sure that this could withstand that. What we've tried to do is look at those local feedstocks, look at those local demand sinks, look at those infrastructure pieces, and said we believe at this moment in time, based upon the current market conditions and the current legislation and policy situation, that these 9 have a chance to get off the ground. Within that, it's worth saying we have 3 cases. We have what we call a base case, a growth case, and then something which we all hope for, which is a full potential case. The base case incorporates things that we believe that could be started today, yesterday, and have a high likelihood of success to get off the ground within the next 3 to 5 years, maybe 6 or 7. And in order to do that, 2 things need to be taken into consideration. A, can we incentivize the private sector to step in and invest and take these projects forward? And B, in order to do that, do we have feedstock that really, really is sustainably sourced? What we don't want to do is beholden to importing things on big ships that burn heavy diesel oil, which, when you look at the carbon intensity on a full life cycle basis, just doesn't make any sense to me. So hopefully that gives you an indication of why we ended up with these 9. Will these 9 be the ones that actually get off the ground? The likelihood of things will evolve. 2 things will drive that. Other investment going into technology today, which may be better, more efficient, more effective. And secondly, the nature of the private sector parties that will come to bear and hopefully take Project Willow forward. They will also have their own views of what they're willing to invest in and what they're willing to do in terms of taking risk and looking for the reward that they need for their shareholders. So at the moment we have is a starter for 10, a real starter for 10 that should incentivize the private sector and take us forward, but it will evolve.
Okay, so I think you have answered one of my other questions. So really what you're saying is there might be external changes in the landscape that will shift as to what is realistic and deliverable, and other new things that may emerge as contenders. Okay, can I ask...
May I just add to that?
Sure.
And it's a point that I wanted to make earlier. I think it was... I'm sorry, I can't...
Vance.
Miss Vance, I can't see your... Apologies. Miss Vance's question, which... If we look at the global landscape on a hydrocarbon basis, the investment going in refineries across the world needs to be taken into consideration. So there's a lot of investment going on in the Middle East, in Africa, which will further put pressure on UK refineries, not just Grangemouth, but all of them. That will also have an implication of how much capital gets invested in low-carbon technology, and that will also have an impact on Willow going forward. So my point here is that global perspective, not just from how capital gets allocated to low carbon, but how it gets allocated to hydrocarbon, will be party and will determine what the shape of Willow looks like in 5, 10, 15 years' time. Sorry, I just think that's really important.
No, I appreciate that, thank you. Can you tell me what you think the barriers are to implementing Willow's proposed projects?
I think barriers is quite a hard word. I think some of the risks, I think the two big risks are time and focus, if I may. And what I mean by time is keeping momentum going and being able to engage with the private sector, for government to be able to engage with the various elements of government to bring together some of the changes that are required from a policy and regulatory perspective. I think that timing of running those parallel streams, which are quite complex. I mean, managing a JV between two parties seems to be quite complex. Imagine if you have 5 or 6, all of them vying for different things because they've got different challenges and different ambitions of their own. So that timing is important, I think, and keeping the momentum. And the hope would be that some type of memorandum of understanding across the first wave of those private sector entities could be achieved before the summer recess. Gosh, wouldn't that be something? The second thing is focus. The worst thing that could possibly happen, and it's a risk, is we have this select committee hearing, there's a little bit of stuff in the press, then it starts to peter out. And what happens is that attention gets diverted onto other assets, other things, other catastrophes, and Willow doesn't maintain focus from those who can actually make change, and that is the private sector and the public sector. So those are the two risks I see going forward. Are they barriers? No. Do they influence the success of Willow? Yes, and potentially the shape as well.
Okay, so we're now in the position where we have 9 proposed projects, some more expensive than others and some longer lead times than others. So that leads me to ask, should this have happened years ago? Because it feels to me as if it should have. And were there any conversations around this type of project that happened when you had those original discussions? I think it was 5 years ago with both UK and Scottish governments.
Yes. A feature of all our discussions with government, the financial position of the refinery as it stood, the necessity for there to be a move to a terminal to maintain continuity of supply, and the issues around the hurdles to low carbon development, low carbon manufacturing on site. And it's worth noting that whilst we talk about Grangemouth here, it's just simply the lighthouse for this. Everything that's come out of Willow will be of universal application to the other industrial clusters in the UK. And as Anu said, with the investment going into bigger, more modern refineries in Middle East, Asia and Africa, I would suspect there will be pressure on the UK's other refineries, and I bet your bottom dollar they're welcoming the findings of Willow and are hoping that they're pushed on with the pace and rigour that we're trying to engender here.
Sorry, I was going to say,
yes.
and indeed, I guess the refinery conversations are the starting point in terms of time and place. But it's important that this is, and you can see it in the findings, the projects that are in the suite of 9 projects, is it's more than producing transport fuels. It's about manufacturing. And that's because Grangemouth itself is a much wider entity than just the refinery, even with the obvious impact of the refinery's transition that's within there. So this is about trying to create the energy transition for all of the workers that are currently in Grangemouth. In fact, the opportunity, and it's in the sort of the subtitle on the Willow report, the opportunity is for delivering growth, actually. So success of Willow is considerably more than 400 jobs, or 2,500 jobs. It's about actually having a growth in manufacturing sector within Grangemouth. And as Iain says, also providing the template for the rest of the UK and the other industrial clusters, because the challenges that we face in trying to develop Willow are going to be experienced across the UK by all of the other manufacturing sectors, and it's important that we keep that, personally, firm belief in manufacturing, because that's the way that we create wealth in the nation.
What I would say is this is really exciting. Willow is probably one of the most exciting assets I've had the privilege to work on. It's a real opportunity for change for the UK. It's the first of a kind where you can bring together circularity, energy transition, you can build out security of supply, and it's applicable to other opportunities within the UK. Coming back to your time point, EY went through a competitive process to win this piece of work. So we started when that process started, and we started at the beginning of sort of September. Could we have had more time? Of course. I'm a consultant. I'm always going to want more time. I'm going to want to check as much data as I can. I want to make sure it's as empirically rigorous as possible. But this is exciting right now. We just got to maintain focus and make sure we do it within time.
If you think about what we've done in the last 6 months, we have moved at a transactional pace, working hand in glove with government in a way that's never been done before, to try and articulate a case for change. What's that led to that's real? It's led to the Prime Minister announcing up to £200 million of national, I think a base of £200 million of National Wealth Fund monies, and the First Minister in Scotland announcing £25 million there as well. That is to be applauded. That is a start. However, money alone will not drive a success case for Grangemouth. We've identified through our decision-based roadmap submitted to government the necessary regulatory hurdles that need to be addressed. If those are addressed, then you start to unlock the third-party investment to site that you need, and then industry will do what industry does. Industry is looking for investable proposition. Grangemouth is a fabulous asset. It's got top-tier infrastructure, excellent utilities, fabulous logistics. If you cannot make the energy transition work at somewhere like Grangemouth, then you need to fundamentally revisit as a nation, what are we trying to do as part of a low-carbon economy build-out, because Grangemouth is absolutely the hub for those sorts of activities going forward.
Thank you, and I do appreciate that we now have a roadmap of sorts and there is clarity and ambition there. However, there are still people concerned about their jobs, they're concerned about their communities, and they're really concerned about the gap between the closure of the refinery and moving forward with some of the projects in Willow. So I do just have to seek clarity on this point, that there were Petroineos did suggest to UK and Scottish governments 5 years ago that this work should be commenced so that communities aren't left with the gap and the position that they are now in. Is that correct?
Talked about the case for change with senior politicians for a number of years. What changed really for us was when the Labour government came in, Mr Miliband and his team just got it in a way that we hadn't had before, and with his leadership and his stewardship and the day-to-day involvement of Mr Shanks, and similarly with Miss Martin in the Scottish Government, we've driven at this transactional pace, and I mean like an M&A pace of progress, effectively working 6 days a week, 12 hours a day to drive this.
16 hours a day.
Through to conclusion. So yes, you're absolutely right, Ms Sullivan, and I can understand the desire to look back and push us on that. Willow was never able to respond to what happened historically. That is what it is. However, what it has done is articulate a very powerful case for change, and my hope is that this committee and other committees like it will hear what we are saying, will understand the rigour and the discipline with which we've applied ourselves to this question, and seek to apply continual pressure on government to make the case for change real. And if you do, as I said before, industry will do what industry does, and actually that headline figure of 200 million for the government will become a backstop, because ultimately, in a perfect world, that won't be required, or it will only be required for the most difficult projects.
So just to ask my final question at this juncture, can I ask who's in charge of the site's future, and how confident are you that they will act on Project Willow's recommendations?
So
The next phase of Project Willow, as you'll be aware, is being managed by Scottish Enterprise. They're fronting it, and I understand in the background they'll have the support of OFI, National Wealth Fund and Scottish Development International.
Thank you. And your confidence?
We will work with them.
Forward.
We will work with them throughout the process to make sure that the best parties are brought to site and the best projects are given the opportunity for success, provided government does its bit and moves with pace and rigour to address the regulatory changes that we've articulated in our decision-based roadmap.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have several requests for supplementaries, so I would ask my colleagues to be as brief and succinct as they can be. Harriet Cross.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you all for coming. It was just more on the workings of Project Willow and how contingent it is on the other operations ongoing at Grangemouth. So obviously you've got the petrochemicals side and also the Forties pipeline. How important in the planning of Project Willow and the feasibility of the 9 projects within Project Willow is, for example, the Forties pipeline, and your reflections on any change in the operations of the North Sea, decline of the North Sea and the timescale of that, and how will that impact the success or otherwise of these in Project Willow?
Yeah, I think it's key to recognise that if we're going to transition, we're talking an energy transition, we have to transition from something. Mm-hmm. So in that respect, the quick answer is very important that Forties pipeline system and especially the chemicals business are still there, and they are both intrinsically linked with each other. So there's feed from the North Sea gas that has to go somewhere. It goes into the chemicals processes. So if there's no chemicals process, you kind of have a domino effect potentially out to the North Sea in the field. And it would be remiss of me not to take the opportunity to say this, that the chemical sector is struggling. It's a cyclical by its nature. We are currently seeing, as with sort of global economic demand, we are what we would term as bottom of cycle. This is a good asset, middle of cycle, top of cycle. In fact, the core of the chemicals complex is our ethylene cracker, which is probably in the top 10% of capacity in Europe. It's a really good asset and a really advantaged asset. But and you will have seen the announcements from our owner, we are struggling massively with high energy costs that we see and with high carbon costs that put us at a significant disadvantage against other areas and other regimes that are importing into Europe and the UK their product with a quarter or a fifth of the energy costs and with no carbon taxation. And that means that we've got a challenge for survival in the existing businesses. So we need help, and we've been in conversations with government about this, but we need help and assistance in actually making sure that we bridge and we go there, because the assets are good assets, well run, safe, and we just need to make sure that they're there to be able to transition from.
If I may add, Ms. Cross, when we were looking at Willow, two other things that we were looking at were efficiency and effectiveness. Mm-hmm. So how can we do this in the most cost-effective way possible?
And can you just speak up a bit, please?
Of course. Sorry. Is that better? How can we do this in the most cost-effective way as possible and as quickly as possible? And when we've looked at the lay of the land, the infrastructure there, what we've tried to do is say, with the minimum amount of effort, what can we use today? And what would that mean in terms of making things more cost-effective and efficient? But as we've designed the 9 projects, we've also then looked at the opportunities between the projects, the synergies, so to speak. So one of the good examples here is we've talked about sustainable aviation fuel, and particularly the HEFA plant. Well, actually, the relationship between the HEFA plant and the hydrothermal plastics recycling and the bio-waste pyrolysis is actually quite important, because they could become feedstocks into the HEFA plant. And that accelerates things. That makes the whole thing a bit more circular. It puts less reliance on other feedstocks being required. So it's partly about the localized infrastructure that's there today, and it's partly about making sure that we identify, map, and therefore model the synergies between those different technical assets. that point that I made before around focus is going to be important, because you're going to have different people owning and operating likelihood as different plants. And their commercial arrangements between the two are going to need to be modelled, mapped, and make sure that everybody has their fair share of whatever pie is available. So it's about the localised infrastructure, but it's the relationship between the different assets as well. And I think that's worth highlighting. Yeah.
And indeed, there is a bigger infrastructure opportunity. Sorry, I end up going big when I think of these things, but there is a unique opportunity that to me became apparent when we've gone through Willow, and this is looking at things like, and this is in the sort of the later tranches of enabling the wind resource, which we have in Scotland, and into green hydrogen, is actually there is a meeting point, I hope, in Grangemouth of that green hydrogen being pulled down, developing those assets and pulling the infrastructure. But actually, to enable that to get to e-methanol and synthetic molecules, you need biogenic CO2. You need CO2 to be brought to Grangemouth. And that's where Acorn would come in as a unique opportunity. So in Scotland, the Acorn TNS can provide, along with Scott Connect, so the National Gas Transmissions Project working up and down the Scotland, could act as the aggregator of CO2, using similar schemes of permitting like green electricity or biomethane. You could deem biogenic CO2 to be delivered at Grangemouth, and it probably would be brought there, because there are quite a number of sources around in the south of Scotland and the Central Belt. And you actually have the opportunity for bringing those two together in Grangemouth to get to e-methanol, for a go from methanol to jet, to have that as a chemicals feedstock. So thinking in the Willow report about the magic triangle of what you want to get in a project, there is the feedstock that we've got through green hydrogen, which we should be able to have as a wonderful resource within Scotland. And we've also got a unique opportunity with Acorn that actually, what in a lot of areas is a CO2 disposal system, actually could be a value opportunity, have a value proposition and growth proposition for Scotland. We've got that linked with infrastructure, the ability to reuse the existing oil and gas infrastructure, national gas transmissions infrastructure that goes up and down between the central belt of Scotland, not 15, 20 kilometres away from site, all the way up to St Fergus. And then you've got the demand, the last key bit that you need in the triangle. There's a sweet spot, which is that sustainable aviation fuel, methanol to go into maritime fuels, or even in as a chemical feedstock. So it's a perfect example of, bigger supply chain opportunities, not just the synergies that Anu was articulating that are within Grangemouth.
It's elegant. It's very elegant.
Thank you. Stephen Flynn.
Yeah, just on that specific issue then, in relation to the Acorn project, how vital is it that project is given the backing of government, both in terms of fiscal regime, but also the licensing permit, which has long been asked for?
If you want to get to the end state, and I think there's been a lot of conversations about Acorn, if you like, just in the transportation and storage and the carbon capture sense. I hope with that last bit that I try to articulate the optimism and the vision. If you want to get to that end state of significant large quantities of e-methanol production and all that could bring, then Acorn is essential to delivering that. It probably, in terms of timeline, I mean, Anu's point, yes, we always want all of this to bring in as quickly as possible. And this goes back to some of the challenges that exist in trying to get this together, because you're now going to have to coordinate the wind resource development with the green hydrogen development with the infrastructure to bring it to Grangemouth at the same time as the CO2 infrastructure, and all of this all happening. It's a challenge. It will take a time, and I guess within the timelines, that's really where we're saying, look, realistically, that's at least a decade away, I think, from within there.
Acorn itself has been stop-start for a long time now. Predates me being in Parliament.
Yep.
And indeed there was variations of it beforehand. Do you feel that there's an acceptance within government now as to the urgency of making sure that project is given the green light in the way that others have?
I think that's a hard question for me to ask as to what I think government thinks about and what they're saying, particularly with the comprehensive spending review going on at the moment. Do I think we're getting to a pivotal point in actually having we need to provide a clear path forwards and a timeline and a commitment for those people that have invested? I'm thinking the Acorn partners, not INEOS, but the Acorn partners have invested. Yeah, I think they need to see that timeline, to see what they're going to do. They need that commitment to be able to keep their investment.
And just to segue back to INEOS, thank you for your work, by the way, and your positivity. It's very refreshing and good to hear. In relation to the projects that have obviously been outlined, the 9 projects in of themselves and within Willow, what time frame do you think is viable for those to come on stream? And are you expecting investors, perhaps the likes of those who are sitting beside you at the table at the moment, to want to be in a position to move them forward at pace and at scale?
There's 2 questions, if I may. The first one is, how quickly could we mobilise and get something off the ground to continue the momentum? And I think some of that comes down to the public sector being able to push forward some of the reforms that we're advocating for. The second part of that is the private sector to be engaged more formally. And we could start that today, tomorrow, yesterday. My hypothesis is the moment you have that first MOU and you've got actual capital being deployed in development expenditure, in DevEx, then you could move at pace and have 1, 2, 3 assets potentially commissioned by the end of the decade, if not before. The big one is Heifer, which is complicated, as we've all talked about, and similarly, some of the points that the Unite Union raised last week, we agree with. There's a lot there to think about, and there's a lot there to understand in terms of the overall energy system. So our hypothesis is that you could have some assets off the ground by the end of the decade, if not before, and potentially a Heifer plant in the early parts of 2030, 2031, 2032. As for what that constellation of private sector entities looks like, I just don't know. You can imagine I've asked, but we don't know. And I think probably...
So why don't we ask then? Are Petroineos interested in taking forward any of these proposals that are being outlined in Willow within the timeframes that we'd obviously hope for?
We are actively evaluating the conclusions of Willow. As you can appreciate, there's been 2 teams. There's been the team looking at running Willow. So it was our project. We conceived it. We ran with EY at pace to deliver it. In parallel with that, there's a team looking at the opportunities arising from it. And in addition, one of the key roles we'll play in the very near term is that of landlord and in conjunction with INEOS, utilities provider. So what's central to the success for Willow is access to land, utilities and logistics. And we've said from the very get-go of this project that we want to see maximum employment, maximum investment into the site, regardless of who that is. So yes, we're reviewing the projects, but what we're not doing, because it's not the right thing to do, is jumping to the head of the queue. So that's on the Petroineos side. On the PetroChina side, they've expressed an interest in the potential SAF pathway, because that's clearly a place that they've played in globally. And then I think in respect of INEOS, there might be an appetite for other projects as well.
Yes, I mean, INEOS more from the petrochemical side of things, so potentially some of those early projects, so I guess go through the same routine as Iain, as a landlord and owner of land, but between us, we only own a fraction of the land that's in Grangemouth. There are other parties, and there's also linkages between Willow delivering with the Grangemouth Future Industry Board activities and also with Forth Green Freeport activities. So there are plenty of other landholders in there who should be within there, and hence Ian's point about not being the front of the queue. But we have that opportunity. There are certain options within plastics recycling that look very interesting that's within there. It could be new processes. So if e-methanol becomes available as a feedstock, any processes that are derived from that could be within there. So I think we remain open and looking at the options as much as any of the other investors. And I would suggest for the success, the long-term sustainability success of Grangemouth, we need to have as broad a base of investors as we possibly can, as many different companies that are involved in there as we possibly can.
The likelihood is that your investors will cycle out based upon the maturity of the site. So as the site matures, certain risk profiles will step in, and you'll have different owners from where you would have them in a year's time or 2 years' time to 5, 10, 15 years' time. And therefore, the level of, forgive this horrible word, but it's the only one I could use, optionality that you need in the delivery vehicle and the setup of that today is really important. Really important.
Thank you. Antonia Bands, did you have a...
Thank you. Mr Hardie, you mentioned and colleagues have mentioned some of the regulatory barriers that need to come down in order for the options in Project Willow to be realistic. I think it's important for this committee to shine a light on what those regulatory barriers are, where they sit and what your confidence is that they can be removed in a timescale that makes these developments possible.
So I'll get Anu to speak to some of the detail, but just to hopefully help answer your question, Ms Bunce, behind the PID, the public information document that you've seen, there is a strategic outline case which was prepared for HM Treasury. That's a green book document that articulates both the case for change, so in terms of the changes that need to be made, the specific changes that need to be made, when and why, the consequence, but what it does vitally, and I don't think this has done before, it actually puts a government value to it. So when we look at projects, we look at IRR, MPVs, rate of return on the investment made. What we've done in our document to government is we've articulated the decarbonisation benefit, the economic benefit, the jobs benefit, and the energy security benefit. So those are the levers, those are the things that government seeks to ensure, and that's what we've done for each of the necessary changes. And we can maybe pick a couple of the projects anew and describe some of the changes and the relative challenge to them. Absolutely.
Maybe just to frame that, there are sort of 5 areas of focus that government could rally around. Let's be positive. The first thing is grant funding, fine, particularly for those smaller entities that perhaps don't have a balance sheet but have the technological capability. So there's a grant funding, there's a state-sponsored investment programme.
Very official, but I was talking about the regulatory requirements that are necessary. We'll come on to money.
Absolutely fine. And then there's the regulatory and policy elements around market reform for biofuels. So that's a big ticket item. The hydrogen economy, making sure that market support mechanisms are there, and stimulating low carbon demand. So this is helping to accelerate policy around low carbon chemicals and plastics demand, supporting that sort of demand build up. Some of the sort of more examples is about, we did make a lot of requests here. We made 35 plus, out of which we have sort of articulated 1 or 2, maybe 3, which are must-haves almost. One of the ones that I think could be pertaining to this is the heifer cap exemption for domestic cover crop feedstocks, as well as the heifer cap around sort of being extended by 10 years to allow us to bring in and use other types of feedstocks like used cooking oil and tallow. So those are 2 examples of the sort of things that we can do. We understand the sustainability and the ecological reasons why those caps are in place, but if they could be extended for a period of time to give us momentum, then what it does is it allows us to be able to start the sort of development process, bring in that external capital, build up the supply chains around these assets, which need to be done. And they have the additional benefit of ancillary sort of jobs, ancillary industry and ancillary value to the Scottish economy and to the UK economy as well. So that gives you a flavour of the type of things we have.
And is there a document you can perhaps share with the committee on these points? You mentioned that you'd submitted a PID to the Treasury.
You've got the PID, sorry, that's our shorthand for the 30-page public information document. What Treasury has is a strategic outline case that articulates the necessary changes for each of the projects and the necessary benefits that would flow therefrom.
Okay. And you're able to share that? Or a version of that?
I would need to check, Ms Bunce. That's with Treasury, that's a Green Book document. So let me check and I will get back to Ms Ferguson.
Thank you very much. You're going to have lots of homework, Mr Hardie.
Is it right?
Torco Crichton.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, gentlemen, for coming in. Anu, sustainable aviation fuel is seen as the holy grail for the aviation industry and perhaps for Grangemouth as well. How realistic is it to make, fuel from chip fat oil?
Good question. So if we address the question in 3 parts, the first one is, can you get enough feedstock in the right manner, at the right place, at the right time? Does the technology exist today to be able to process that into sustainable aviation fuel? And then can you get that sustainable aviation fuel produced at a price that somebody can pay for? If all of those three things hold true, then yes, it's feasible. The trick is getting all three of those things to work on the same site at the same time. And the biggest problem that we find isn't necessarily the technology at the moment, it is the feedstock and the price at the end. That, if we could work through with some of the sort of suggestions that we've made through the report, could enable a viable asset to get off the ground at Grangemouth.
Okay, I get you. You mentioned one of the obstacles was the heifer cap exemption. Sounds like something to do with cows to me, but that might not be.
Apologies, yes.
What barriers, what regulatory barriers could, or what role could the government play in getting you to producing SAF?
So I think the first thing is allowing sort of hydrogenated esters and fatty acids processing to produce sustainable aviation fuel, to extend the cap. Currently, we are seeing a cap coming into force that's 70% from heifer, declining over a period of time, so that you incentivize other technologies like e-fuels to come through, power to liquids. The government could do two things. First of all, extend that timeline, and secondly, incentivize some of the alternative feedstocks that could go into that asset as well, particularly around cover crops. So now we're going away from energy into agriculture. And what we've seen in other parts of the world with other companies who are heavily investing is a move to invest in non-food energy crops. So these are things that don't necessarily damage the soil and can be planted and harvested outside of a usual food crop cycle in order to produce oil seeds that could be then used to produce sustainable aviation fuel. There is enough land in Scotland, and one of the things that we've suggested is trials need to be done with the support of DEFRA and the UK government, Scottish government, and some of the agricultural bodies in Scotland to see if they could do similar trials to what they've done in the US, where they have been successful in this activity. Okay,
is there I see a danger here of Grangemouth being described as the Drax of Scotland, where you kind of bring in sustainable materials from somewhere else to create a new fuel?
We've tried to avoid that.
Yeah, so let me be very clear, and this was, it's funny you raise that. One of our red lines for the Willow team was that Drax, for our opinion, was not an exemplar of good around sustainability. So we were very clear that 100% reliance on an overseas bio feedstock was not suitable. That said, it's important that we recognise the limitations of domestic feedstocks. We seek to maximise them where we are. Anu spoken very eloquently about the cover crop potential, and actually I'm going to be even more enthusiastic than Anu on this one. This is an example of really where Willow is at its best. If we get that right, you are in the world of a circular economy. You are in the world of genuine economic growth. You will be creating new value chains that simply do not exist today. That, by definition, is economic growth. And that's what we must be seeing. And it's relatively low-hanging fruit. It's something that could and should be done. The Willow team would suggest in order to unlock that HEFA-derived SAF pathway. The other point to note, as Anu touched on it, is the pricing. Currently, the cost of HEFA versus traditional jet fuel is 4 or 5 times that. Government has talked about but has not put in place any pricing support mechanism for SAF. It's currently just using the stick method, which is the mandate ever increasing over time, as opposed to the carrot method of, okay, let's try and help industry do the right thing and move away. And there absolutely is an appetite for this in the industry. You're in this very novel world where you're seeing airlines invest in SAF production facilities. I cannot think of any other industry where that rings true. So if your end user, if your airlines, your British Airways, your IAGs, your KLMs are investing in manufacturing for SAF, then that tells you there's a market pool, and it tells you that one other link in the chain isn't there. And I think at present in the UK, the issue, the determinative issue is around feedstock supply. In Europe, they've got a different view. They do not have a ban on HEFA-derived feedstocks, and as a result, they will be exporting their HEFA-derived fuel into the UK, where we're obliged under the mandate to purchase it, notwithstanding that could be a domestic pathway, but for some relatively simple regulatory changes which are within the gift of UK government.
You sound excited yourself about sustainable aviation fuel. Petrochina is one of your big shareholders.
I think the SAF pathway, so people, let's look at why are people excited about SAF? Because you've got that market pull, because aviation is a hard to decarbonise sector, but actually in terms of technical readiness, that first generation technology exists today and could be deployed. I think when you step out to synthetic fuels, the eSAF that we spoke of, super exciting, and that's the holy grail, to get to a wholly synthetic fuel where you're taking hydrogen and CO2, putting that together to create jet fuel. That's a fabulous place, but we have to be very, very realistic. That is a good way down the path. And there's a lot of other projects that have to happen, which is why I knew was talking about the sequencing being so important. But there is a near-term win, I think, to be had in SAF. And I just look to the market. The market does what the market does. And as I said, you've got airlines investing in production facilities. That tells you there's demand. But as yet, there's not the fully built up supply chain, and therefore the investment case necessary to invest, let's be honest, hundreds of millions of pounds isn't there.
Something like 2 billion to get Grangemouth to SAF. Would Petrochina be interested in doing that?
I think the SAF pathway is open to everyone. I think there will be, as Anu said, multiple different actors coming in and out of the projects at any one time. I think the fully built up cost we're talking about there is the synthetic SAF. And as I say, there's a lot of people that will play in the broader Grangemouth cluster.
There are over 60 companies right now who are pushing on trying to get their eSAF, electro-SAF, off the ground, who are in different stages of raising capital. If one or two of those were able to be party to the Willow concept, you could see momentum building very quickly.
The evidence to this committee from Unite and others was that sustainable aviation fuel SAF is where Grangemouth should be heading. They said just go for it. I know there's a sequence to go through, but do you think we should accelerate, that we should kind of push hard on that? What would your message be to government on that?
So it's great to have their support and momentum behind that, and with respect to that, we're in furious agreement with Unite. However, the examples that they cite as being able to turn, and I think they've been on the record as saying, Grangemouth could be turned into a SAF facility overnight. That's simply not the case. They've given some information into the Willow team. We've reviewed it, and the examples that they've chosen are not analogous to where we're at with Grangemouth. So yes, the headline of a development of SAF at Grangemouth we're absolutely aligned on, but the feedstock that they've referenced, and one of their examples is soybean, for example, that's currently banned in the UK. It falls foul of the legitimate policy decision about the use of arable land for food versus fuel. The other one they've suggested is in Scandinavia, and that uses the byproduct of printing, of paper mill manufacture, which is a very well established industry in the Nordics. We don't have that industry in the UK, so we don't have that byproduct available as a feedstock. The other is the temporal aspect, so any suggestion that we could simply convert in a year or two is very wide of the mark. That might be your construction phase, but to get to that construction phase, you've got 5, 6, 7, 8 years of engineering, design, planning, commissioning, etc., all of which we are in the starting phase of now. So yes, we want to move, and yes, we want to move at pace, but it's not going to be an overnight fix.
If I may, the last point on this was the assets that were referenced by the Unite Union are relatively high in terms of how recently they were built and how efficient they are. So they rank highly on the Nelson Index, whereas Grangemouth's a very different beast in that respect. So those assets, you could see that sort of development going on at a greater pace, but we also know that the pre-development work was years and years before a final decision was made.
Okay, so sustainable aviation fuel grown and refined in Scotland 2040?
So again, it comes back to my original point of those three parts. If those three parts could come into unison, you could see some type of heifer plant getting off the ground in the early 2030s, mid-2030s. But it requires, remember, time and focus. We need to start moving yesterday.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. We have a supplementary from Kirstine Sullivan.
Thank you, and it's a very brief one. So as we've touched upon this point, the view of the unions, in particular Unite, that that there could be SAF production up and running in Grangemouth in a very short period of time. And there have also been suggestions that the existing infrastructure on the refinery site could be repurposed for that. Do you disagree with that position?
It's the same answer that I think we've just given to Mr. Crichton, which is the feedstock that they've suggested on those other assets are not comparable. We don't have those in the UK.
I absolutely take that on board,
And
but
then
I want to focus on the infrastructure point, because you've said it would take 6, 7 or 8 years of engineering. I think the Unite's position is you've got existing infrastructure that could be repurposed in a much shorter time frame. So I wonder if you could give your view on that.
As we've looked at the assets, we do disagree. They're not comparable constructs of refinery. So the machines and the parts of the refineries that they've referenced are just not the same. So that's the first point. The second point is coming back to your timeline. Our timeline includes time for government to evolve policy and regulation where appropriate, time for private sector parties to come on board and to get comfortable with what they want to design and build. And then for that development cycle, that development period will probably very similar to where the Unite Union is. It is a sort of 3-4 year process to get to a commissioning of an asset. But it's all the other stuff that needs to happen first, which also happen in the other assets.
I'm going to move on to Antonia Bance now.
Thank you very much. I wanted particularly to ask Mr. Hardie and Mr. Pritchard their view on the realism of the projects proposed in Willow. I've heard enthusiasm for the opportunities, but that hasn't yet been matched by the sort of commitment that would give the community and the wider sort of industry in the UK confidence that any or all of the projects laid out in Willow will actually go forward.
It's a very good question, and thank you for asking that. I think there's two answers to it. Firstly is the level of rigour and diligence we put into this report was phenomenal, and we did that in partnership with government. So there is nothing in here that could not materialise at Grangemouth. Indeed, there may be more, and that's an important point to note. This isn't just because Willow is not the bookends of Grangemouth's potential. So that's point one. Point two is it's chicken and egg, Miss Bance. We've articulated that these are possible, but it's possible subject to, and I wish that wasn't the case. I wish that it was just a case of press and go and we could deliver on Willow, but the subject twos are important. Government needs to affect the change in order for industry to do what industry does, which is to crowd in and invest in these projects. Absent that, industry are not going to. If you think about the nature of where we're at in the cycle, there is a huge amount of risk associated with investing in nascent and, let's call it what it is, sub-economic low carbon manufacturing in the UK. Therefore the risk appetite to do it has to be high, your balance sheet has to be high. As a result, the people who have access to that sort of capital have access to projects all around the world. So we have to put Grangemouth on the map. We have to say, invest here. We have to be positive about Grangemouth, and government has to be pushed to drive the change. If that's happened, and if you look at the nascent the nascent benefits of Grangemouth around logistics, utilities, and heritage, I think we will see investment.
Will we get to the 3.5 billion that we need?
That remains to be seen. We've set out a pathway. I don't know. I wish I had a crystal ball, but you've got nothing but ambition from this side of the table to get us there, and the base case and the diligence. So whilst and we've touched on this before, whilst the public information document might be 30 pages, behind that there is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of diligence. We have put up nothing that we do not believe could be delivered, subject to the government changes that we've articulated in the strategic outline case.
From a technical point, I think that was the process and the process that Anu outlined that we went through of starting with 368, did you say was the actual number? It got confusing because Anu kept on reducing them and I kept on adding them back in the process as well, just to make it more of a challenge for them. But I think what we landed on, certainly if you think there's 3 timescales of sort of possible by 2030, subject to all of the caveats that Iain's just mentioned, and then in the next by the mid-30s, so that's sort of bringing in some of the bio elements, and then probably it's another decade after that when you can really see the build out on wind to hydrogen and the synthetic molecules. But what we were at pains to do was to make sure that these were at a high technology readiness level, so that the kind of technologies that were being talked about were not test tube scale lab slightly bigger, that they were actually proven. They're not risk free, but they've got relatively few risks in them versus some of the other ones, where some of the challenges do exist, and again articulated is in those nascent supply chains. So yes, you can build a bioethanol based upon forestry grown in Scotland, but that's a supply chain that again needs to develop and grow, so more of that growth opportunity that's within there. But that does need to be broken into. Even in some of the, if you were going first generation bioethanol, some of the challenges you've got are, I can grow the crop if you'll take the feedstock. It's like, well, I'll build the plant to take it if you guarantee the crop. Okay, great, that's fantastic. Who underwrites the risk as we ramp up in crop? What happens if there's a crop failure in the first couple of years? And that plays back to some of the role that I think government can help with, is underpinning that risk of establishing those new supply chains.
So we were working with a different company in a different part of the world in a similar concept. And the biggest issue around that was, how do you map the price of the seed to sustainable aviation fuel? Mm-hmm. It's not been done before. How do you get people to believe that you've got that price matching all the way through, and that value is and the risk is appropriately associated? So it's that level of complexity that underpins what Colin's saying, and this is where we think there is something here, because we can see over a period of time transitioning from one feedstock to another to allow the assets to get off the ground and those markets to mature with government support, particularly if it's supporting on some of the policy side on the pricing of some of the outputs, as well as enabling and engendering some of the feedstocks to get off the ground.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. I guess my point continues to be that the signals that could be sent from Petroineos and from INEOS, making it clear that they were intending, if at all possible, if the risk profile were correct, if the financials added up, and if the regulatory environment were correct, they were intending to make that investment such that they would transition to sustainable aviation fuel. Do you not think that that market signal would be really, really important in unlocking other investment, unlocking the government action that you need, and also winning the confidence of not just the industrial community around Grangemouth, but those all over the country, such as those I represent in the Black Country, looking at this prime example of good jobs going and a hiatus?
Chicken and egg.
Exactly. Could you, in this point, play a different role to unlock that chicken and egg?
Could government play a different role, be at the vanguard of this, aggressively push the regulatory change to allow industry to crowd in behind? So what we have done, Ms Bance, is we've written to Scottish enterprises, as I say, who are leading on the project delivery phase, and we've expressed our strong interest in different aspects of the Project Willow report, and we will continue to work with them both in every available capacity, landlord, utility provider, project developer, because it's going to require a consortium based going forward. What we have in Willow is not just a case of one company coming in and putting a lot of chips on the table. It's going to require new strategic partnerships to be developed.
And similarly from INEOS, we will be putting in you have. I've still to write, but we'll be going into Scottish Enterprise on the same basis. So, but it is back down to the chicken and egg. The one thing I know, INEOS will invest where it can invest. That's what it's done. But it's back to your point. It also does that on a global platform. So we need to make the UK and Grangemouth be the attractive place to invest, to win that funding. Actually, not just from Petroineos, Petroineos, INEOS, but from all of the other potential investors that are out there, including some of the airline consortia that you've talked about, and all of the other people who are in there. We need to make it the attractive place. So we do need to crack the problem of how we change the regulatory and policy framework in order to be able to create the investment, because at the moment it doesn't work. That was kind of where we started from within Willow, and we've tried to articulate, well, what can you change? And importantly, the co-design of Willow, why is it in government's interest, society's interest, the business who provide the employment's interest in order to get those change effects? So we've tried to do that jointly within Willow, if you like.
Elaine Stewart.
This is for Mr Bhambi. Is the UK government's promise of 200 million a sufficient level of public investment to drive through the projects identified in Project Willow?
I think it's admirable and wonderful to have received that level of commitment from the UK government. I think what I'm uncertain of right now is how and where that capital is allowed to be and will be deployed. So it's hard for me to answer that question. But it's a real signal to the private sector that the government means business here. This is important. So we see it as incredibly positive. We were very surprised and very pleasantly, it gave us a warm feeling that, Project Willow is landing and is being taken seriously. Is it sufficient? It depends on how it gets deployed. And part of that will also be when it gets deployed.
That comes on to my next question. So what would the consequences if the 200 million wealth fund did not materialise? What would the consequences be?
Well, I think, first of all, there's a PR issue from a government perspective. I think that's the obvious one. I think, secondly, it'll show the private sector a real lack of support now against Willow. Beyond that, it's hard for me to judge. As I said, we weren't expecting it, so as we've been thinking about how does Willow become a reality, how does it go from lots of pretty documents and slides to being something that creates real jobs and a sustainable ancillary set of businesses around Scotland. As we've looked at that, we hadn't envisaged 200 million being made available from the National Wealth Fund. So I think now that the sort of announcement has been made, you're in a different scenario to how we were before, when we weren't expecting it. And then we were expecting the private sector to step in.
Just on the back of that, how confident are you that the new Grangemouth investment team will attract sufficient private investors?
I can't answer that. I don't know them. Sorry.
Sorry, I was going to make a point just on, and it comes back to the regulatory and policy framework side, that if we get that right, and we create the environment which is going to attract investment, then actually it has the ability to, if you like, lower the requirements. It is very welcome, the support and the signal of support that comes with the announcement of the minimum 200 million ring fence within the National Wealth Fund. But actually the prize is to get as much private investment in as we possibly can from around the globe by getting the regulatory and policy framework right, which actually lowers those burdens.
A bit more positivity to my last answer, Mr. Chair. Yeah. We have had a few people come to us, a few companies globally saying we're interested in Willow, and we've been passing on the details to Scottish Enterprise to take forward. So our hope is that there will be momentum. The bit that will be interesting to observe now will be, remember the complexity between the projects and the different stakeholders that you have across those. Making sure that value doesn't get dropped between those is going to be important for the success of Willow.
And indeed, there have been lots of other entities, different projects. So back to, is it going to be this 9 or could it be more? There are other ideas that people have got that are ancillary who've kind of dropped into my inbox and will be passed across to Scottish Enterprise for that same purpose. So there is the potential that it doesn't look exactly like this 9. It looks like a different, hopefully 18 rather than 9 projects, but there is already interest being created for that investment.
And just in the back of that, so how would you respond to the concerns that bureaucratic inactivity will deter private investment? So I suppose that's really about the policy stuff.
I hope that's not the case. As I say, we've worked really well with Scottish and UK government, from ministers and officials. Everyone knows what needs to be done. Everyone is excited by Willow, and excited both by the output as much as the process. Working hand in glove with government and industry is absolutely the way to make good regulation. And I think government's earned the time now to go away and reflect on the information we've provided to it to make sure it does provide good regulation, and we'll be backing them all the way.
Remember the pressure on time and focus. I think if everyone maintains that, momentum should keep going forward.
Commentary from Torkel Craig.
It's just a quick question, because it strikes me like you talk about the fantastic potential of Willow and how exciting it is, and yet, as Antonio pointed out, you're reluctant to invest yourselves, to put yourselves ahead, Petroineos or PetroChina or INEOS. Why is that?
I don't think you can expect us today to make an investment decision on something that is nascent and sub-economic. So I don't think that's a sensible question to ask.
Neither could we expect anyone else then.
Well, exactly, and that's why we are where we are, Mr. Crichton, because as it stands today, the low-carbon fuel space is not investable by anyone. Hence, the proof point is there is no biofuels development in the UK. So ask yourself, why is that the case? It is the case because the regulatory environment doesn't support it.
Chicken and egg again. Yeah.
Chicken and egg.
And HEFA, you say, is one of the keys to that.
I mean,
HEFA regulation.
HEFA's one thing, but HEFA's one important corner of 9 projects. There's a lot of other projects that are equally important for broader energy and energy security pathways in the UK. It's just the one that seems to have captured the attention of the unions the most, and hence appears in the paper more than anything else.
Thank you, Chair.
Just a small question, and partly an observation. The committee recently visited Norway to look at some energy concerns there, and we were told about a project called Green Spot Mongstad. Now, forgive my Norwegian pronunciation, it's probably not correct, but is that a project you're aware of, Mr. Bhambi?
I think the team are aware. We monitor most of the developments. If you ask me any details right now, I would give you the following answer. I'll come back to you very, very quickly if you need some details on it. But yes, I think the team are aware. I'm not personally aware of it.
Was there something from that project that could be of interest, Mr. Harrison?
Only in the sense, and this is what I was going to come to, that it seemed to me to be a project where no idea was off the table because it wasn't practical. Some of the ideas seemed to be almost verging, I think it's right to say, on not quite science fiction, but certainly on the extremes of viability. You know, a non-shore fish farm, for example, was the one that stuck in my mind. But it did seem to me that they were pretty radical in the way that they were looking at possibilities.
We've taken a different approach, as I think we've articulated.
Probably have.
We've grounded this in a technical readiness level, and one of our inbound assumptions was that we couldn't fall below a technical readiness level of 6. And we did that because we knew that we knew the type of capital we wanted to attract, and it's a type of capital that can be deployed to mega projects in the short to medium term. The sort of stuff you're talking about there is super exciting and absolutely will have a role, but it might not have a role for 15, 20, 25 years. Mm-hmm. And that's outside the time horizon that we're looking at for Willow.
Well, I mean, I don't have the technical knowledge, and I certainly don't have the technical documentation to be able to compare and contrast. I wouldn't want to do that. But the fish farm is apparently coming on stream, by the expression, in May. So things do seem to be moving on. Okay. But I didn't get the impression that the ideas were ridiculous ideas. You know, they did all seem to be tested, and there was a great deal of money being invested in them. And I only mention it from the point of view of saying, you might like to read it when you've got nothing better to do.
Once I've done my homework, we'll get stuck into that one.
That'd be great. Kirstine?
Excuse me.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just going to go back to and touch upon my earlier line of questioning. So I think everyone welcomes the delivery of Project Willow, and we are eagerly looking to the next steps, progressing, hopefully at pace. But I think we do. There must be regret that this didn't happen 5 years ago, when you first mooted the idea to both UK and Scottish governments at that time, because now there is an employment gap, and that is causing concern to employees and to the local community. Can you tell me that if the plans under Willow do come to fruition, how long will that employment gap likely to be between the job losses that people are about to experience and the new employment opportunities coming online?
No, I can't tell you, because it depends when those new projects start, Ms Sullivan, so I don't really think you can reasonably expect me to answer that question in any sensible manner.
Is there an expectation? Perhaps that might be a better question for yourself, Anu.
So we hope that the first wave of projects, particularly those in the sort of plastics recycling space, the waste space, you know, there's a possibility they could come online sort of between 2028 and 2030.
Okay, so we're still a number of years away.
Yeah, so you've got a direct jobs element to that, which is where that manifests at a point in time. Then you've got construction jobs and other jobs that could be created in that development cycle. But coming back to Ian's point, there's a lot of uncertainty before we can articulate a realistic timeline.
Okay, so if the refinery workers, and you do have a highly skilled workforce, are forced to seek alternative employment, how will this impact the recruitment for future industries on the site? Because the workforce will go to where they can get employment and high quality, well paid jobs.
That is a point that we can agree on, Ms Sullivan. One of the key partners we spoke through this process was Forth Valley College. They will be central in taking the future case for skills that we've identified and making sure that we are able to put in place the necessary programmes such that there is a flow of young talent that can come and work at Grangemouth, be it in a biorefinery, be it in a green plastics plant, or in a hydrogen facility. As I say, taking a step back, we're agnostic as to what the technology is. We just want to see good jobs at Grangemouth.
We've had many of these stakeholders, like Forth Valley College, as part of the Grangemouth Future Industries Board. And on a very regular basis, we've been sort of, as we've got to a certain stage of analysis, been sharing that quite openly, making sure that all the stakeholders are aware, so they can start thinking about what does it mean in terms of retraining, retooling, reskilling people who will be coming out of the redundancy process.
And that work is happening. PACE are involved, Skills Development Scotland, FVC are involved, and actually that is, we've seen the government machine work well in that regard.
So that will, in your view, hopefully mitigate any risks of there not being the skills present in that community to meet the future demand?
I would hope so, Ms Sullivan.
Okay. So, again, and you've probably answered this question, and perhaps from my earlier question, how could the employment gap have been avoided or minimised? But I expect that's maybe through starting Project Willow 5 years ago at least.
I can't answer it any better than you have.
Thank you. Anna, do you wish to add to that?
Just say, what's done is done, but now we have real momentum opportunity. Let's make sure we don't take the foot off the accelerator.
So if I can hopefully just finish on a more positive point, will there be guaranteed jobs in new industries at the site for any Petroineos workers facing redundancy?
I'll fall into my earlier answer, Ms Sullivan. If those projects aren't even sanctioned yet, and they don't exist. I can't promise anyone a job in them.
Are there any pathways that you could see that you could potentially offer?
Almost at pains not to repeat the phrase "it's chicken and egg," but it's chicken and egg, Miss Sullivan. There are necessary precursors that need to change before any party, let alone the existing shareholders, can look to make an investment decision in Grangemouth. Once those things changed, once there's a line of sight to those things being changed, once there's an acceptance by government that they need to change, industry will do what industry does, which is pile into Grangemouth, because it is a fabulous asset. It is a fabulous asset base, and the fact that we've got this level of attention and rigour on it, actually I welcome, because it's highlighting Grangemouth, it's highlighting its potential, and so the more we can have people talking about Grangemouth, the better.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have a supplementary from Antonia Vance? No, that's okay. Okay, that's the end of our questions to you this morning, gentlemen, so thank you very much for that. I'm afraid we did give you a little bit of homework and some documentation we'd like to receive, and it would be very helpful to get that as soon as possible. We do have a number of other evidence sessions in this inquiry, so it'll be some time yet before we make our conclusions public. But thank you very much for coming along today. It's been really interesting to hear of the story and of Willow too. And we look forward to hearing much more about Willow as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Order.